Releasing Trauma is sponsored by the Global Association for Trauma Recovery. The Global Association for Trauma Recovery is a social impact organization serving as a resource for survivors and their families, dedicated to facilitating change by spreading trauma-related awareness and thus creating a more trauma-informed world. Learn more at gaftr.org. Welcome to Releasing Trauma, a Survivor's Podcast. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. I am a survivor of emotional bullying, rape, sexual assault, domestic abuse, and grief. After losing my husband in 2019, I set off on a new adventure to help other women release their trauma and create a life they can cherish. Each week, I will feature a guest expert or a survivor to share their stories, tips, wisdom, and more. The goal is so that you can take away even just the smallest nugget of information you can use in your life right now to make a change, and to remind you that you're not alone. There is life after trauma, and you can move from victim to thriver and create a life you can cherish. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I am your host, Tracy Osborne. With me today is Amy Guerrero, and we are going to talk about trauma and addiction today. So Amy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tracy. It's so great to be here with you this morning and on this full moon. I feel like it's a great day to talk about releasing stuff. So absolutely. I was like, oh my goodness, how cool is that?
There you go. Absolutely. So before we dive into, trauma, addiction, releasing, all that good stuff, tell us a little bit about your backstory.
Yeah, for sure. So, my story starts with trauma. I realized pretty early on, and I started to get to introduced to trauma stuff pretty early on, that it lived in the body when I was in college. And so I had this sense, and definitely a felt sense of like, ooh, like I know that this lives here. I just don't know how to like move it. And so I really went like hardcore into my hot yoga journey. And that really started off my journey into like the healing through the body. And then lots of years went by where my favorite coping mechanisms continued to be alcohol and drugs and behaviors that gave me that instant relief from all of the emotional and pain that I was in, and also like a lot of physical pain, just a lot of discomfort in my own skin. I hit it really well with overachieving, with being really successful, with wearing a lot of masks, with creating parts of me that were able to perform in the world, to look good. And around 36, I started to get the idea like, oh, if I heal all my trauma before I'm 40, then like I'll rock the second part of my life. And so I made a list of all the things that I wanted to do. The biggest thing on that list was to go to the original thing that happened, which was abandonment, right around birth. And so I went and found my birth mom. And just a couple months later, I was physically dependent on alcohol. And then my journey to figuring that out started. And through that journey, I realized that there was not trauma-informed language in the recovery and addiction spaces. And so I felt very misunderstood, really confused, and really like it really ticked my shame up to a level that it had never been at. And so I was like, I would rather just die than fight this fight, basically, which I felt like I was in with myself, with my favorite coping mechanisms, and then with the addiction recovery space. That did not happen. I was unsuccessful at parting ways with the world. No matter how hard I tried, something would save me, and I was meant to be here. I started writing my ideas down in 2014, and by 2016, when I stopped, I started teaching my ideas on how to recover through a body-based, trauma-informed way, a bottom-up approach. And then that's what brings us together, it's that's the short version of my story.
I hear you. There's always a short version and the long version.
For sure.
So you tracked down your birth mom, and that just didn't quite go as planned.
Well, I think that, no, it did not go as planned at all. Like, period. I had this idea, and this was like an idea that I had my whole life. Like, I thought that everyone kind of thought like I did. You only know what you know. And so I was like, well, for sure, by like, 57 or however old she was then, like she would have done some of this work. She had a super traumatic childhood, and ancestrally, like, you know, I've got a lot of stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't the case. And my protector and my rescuer, like, went full on thinking that, like, it was my job again for like the third time in our relationship to support her. And so where I went to, like, to be mothered, right? So, or to at least like understand each other and get to know each other from this level, what happened was I started to rescue. So that part of me just came up so strong, and then it was too much. Um, and I just kept leaning into alcohol, until I woke up shaking. And then I was like, oh shit, we've got a problem here. Like
Right.
a real chemical dependency. And that sucked because I just didn't know that was going to happen. So it's
Right.
like, oh shit. But you know what? I really like today, I can see so clearly, Tracy, that was exactly, of course, the path that I was going to go on. And if it wasn't for me becoming physically dependent on alcohol, I would not have been able to heal at the deep levels that I've healed and release so much that I've released, because I'm doing it through a lens of consciousness. And my coping mechanisms are so much higher now. My coping mechanisms are like a salt bath and a cold water plunge and vagus nerve toning, where it used to be alcohol and sex
Mhm.
and cocaine and all the things.
Yeah. So, when you were in recovery, it's so much more, and I'm speaking just from what I've been told, because I don't have that experience, but when you're in recovery, it's so much more than just recovering from the addiction. You have to actually address the trauma in recovery, or it just doesn't work, right?
In my opinion, I do not see it work. What I do see happen is that people, a lot of people that I support will have 20 or 30 years of abstinence from a substance, miserable, like still full on in a sympathetic fight flight response, and reacting to the world around them because there's so much unprocessed trauma,
Right.
that then through the lens of abstinence, they've just continued to behave in all of the weirdo ways that they were behaving to protect themselves from the early childhood stuff that had gone on in their life. And
Yeah.
so recovery and sobriety are very different to me. It's like, okay, yeah, you're sober, you are not conscious. And I can feel that and see that in your body and in your actions. And my deal was like, I don't want to just be sober because, like, it'll be freaking miserable. I really
Really.
want to step into consciousness.
Well, and I think, just from my research, a lot of people who are addicted to something, when they get sober from that something, they turn to something else. So if it's alcohol, they turn to drugs, or maybe they turn to food, or they turn to sex or gambling, or something like that. So until they deal with the trauma, they find something else to fill that void.
Absolutely. And, in my opinion, every human is, quote unquote, I don't love that word, but like is dependent on something to escape their reality.
Right.
And, so a lot of the people that I support are recovering from from like 27 years of not listening to their intuition, of staying in relationships for way too long, of working and staying busy and using their credentials to hide their pain, using, like food or sugar or social media, or, like there's just so many things that we can hide behind. And, as two women who are committed to getting to that like deeper level, it's clear for us because we're committed to it on a personal level. But when people stop, I mean, the 12-step programs, okay, yes, they do their thing. But I was taught to smoke cigarettes, to eat sugar, to drink a lot of caffeine. And, I was sexually harassed constantly in that space. And my trauma was so sexual that I was like, what the actual bleep, like this is
Right.
not what recovery looks like to me. And that wasn't okay with me. And that sucked because I wanted to feel understood. And so I found myself abandoning myself over and over and over again in different recovery rooms. And I tried them all. Like I was in Smart Recovery, I was in Life Ring, I was in the Buddhist based recovery, I was in 12 step, I was in Coda, I was in like all of the things, learning like, what is this all about? But at the end of the day, if there's a room full of people who aren't looking at the root cause, who aren't looking at the trauma, then all the messaging is conditioning people to believe something without getting to the thing that's underneath of there. And it's scary to talk about shame, and it's scary to talk about emotional trauma. And our nervous systems are designed to keep us safe. So they'll protect us, right? Like, oh, don't go there. Just repeat the same mantras every day, one day at a time. You know, it easy does it, all the
Right.
things. And then that becomes this life of survival, but not really like living.
Yeah. Surviving, not thriving.
Yep, 100.
Yeah, I hear you there. I've been in some of those rooms with friends and family who are alcoholics, and I've sat and listened to some of those meetings, and um, they talk about their stories, but they don't really talk about their trauma. The root base of what's going on, what's caused the addiction. Um, they talk about how much they used to drink or how much they used to do drugs, and all of that. But like you said, yeah, they're still stuck in survival mode, and they're just, I don't know, they're just getting through. They're, like you said, one day at a time. They're just getting by, um, and not really thriving. The ones that I see that are really thriving are the ones that actually go through um, the process and dig deep and uncover all that pain and guilt and shame and self-loathing and all of that, and work through it and release it.
Absolutely. And, if you've spent a lifetime numbing your body, then the coming home to the body is like the scariest thing,
Mm-hmm.
because they, like, so many people, I felt my way through the world. So I was so like, I love my journey because I started with the body. And then that's why it wasn't making sense to me in the all of the recovery spaces, or even in treatment centers. I went to like 8 treatment centers, and it was so hard to find a therapist or a practitioner to meet me where I was at. I was just like, this is so annoying. And introducing people slowly to their body, to the somatics, to the felt sense, like that in itself can be like a 3 to 6 month journey, because it was so numb.
Mm-hmm.
And numb is a feeling, right? And so the judgment and the, I want to stay in my head and I want to think my way through this life that I'm going to have in recovery. But someone with 15 years that's still talking about like their stories, I'm like, what is happening there? Like, you drank over 15 years ago. Like, what's happening now? Right. And it's just a fear. It's easier to stay, I'm an alcoholic, I'm an addict, and I have a disease, than it is to go, oh wait, I can release this. Like I can accept it. I can own it. And I can have a conversation with my body about it and why
Right.
I chose to do it. Cause it's a coping mechanism. It's like it was the solution. I know that if I hadn't especially started experiencing with hallucinogenics and MDMA when I was like in my 18, 19, 20-year-old, like that stuff opened me up to like go, oh wait, I do have trauma. Like this is real. This is really in my body. And I had like journals and journals and journals of me like talking myself through this because I knew what I knew.
Yeah.
And that helped me so much on my work and it continues to help me as I, own this in this space.
Now, you work with people, you mentioned somatic a few times, and you work with people with in somatic experiencing. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and how that helps release the addiction from your body?
Yeah. So, really long story short is that there's so many incomplete nervous system responses that, especially if you've numbed it, if you're out there listening and you're like, oh yeah, like there's so many things that your body wants to complete. And through your consciousness, through your mind, you're not going to be able to think your way to that completion because the nervous system just knows what to do. And so much of my work is like really supporting people to understand that they have a body and that when they're in this response where, like, I love what you said, Tracy, like where you notice people kind of hopping from one coping mechanism to another. So I'm like, ooh, there's a pattern. Now we can somatically release it and allow your body to show us the way to complete that response. So you actually feel the release, the relief of that pattern. And then, yes, then we can marry it with some talk and some action and some behavioral stuff through the coaching experience. But I don't, I sit back and let their body show me what it wants to do. And then the magic starts to happen because then they can really feel the power of that they always had. Like my thing is like I guide you to your truth over and over and over again because it's there.
I like that. It guides you to your truth. I like that.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Like I am not here
because
to save people. I'm here to guide them back to what they already know.
right. Because we tend to cope with our traumas by covering it up with lies that we tell ourselves, so yeah, I like that, guiding you back to your truth.
Oh girl, yeah. I just started a new group program called Recover the Trust. And we're spending the entire month. And like I'm really cutting through their patterns because I'm like, you're lying to yourself. And I'm scrubbing it down. I'm like, oh no, you're lying again. And these people have been with me. Their nervous systems are in a place where they can really feel it and work with it. And it's so beautiful to see that transition because then they're like, oh my gosh, I've known this since I was a little kid. I'm like, yeah, you have. Now
Yeah,
let's make
you
it a way
just
of life.
kind of forget.
Oh yeah. We get conditioned. It's easy. This world is weird.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. So, what are some of the other things that you do, like with your clients, to help them, get back to their truth?
Yeah, well, the first thing that I always start with is the polyvagal ladder actually is teaching them that they have a nervous system and that it's so natural that the way that they've been responding to life is through these fight flight responses or through these freeze responses and then really helping them anchor into what it feels like to be okay. I think what I notice in the space is that if we spend our time in our head and our head and our head, then we're constantly in judgment. And by really helping with them understanding that they have a nervous system, it gets out of judgment and into curiosity. And from there, I can be like, oh, you're totally in a fight flight response. You're in a sympathetic energy. And they can really define it for themselves, which again gives them this control system to like, oh, I wasn't thinking straight. I had no access to the smarter parts of my brain because I was totally activated. And from that place is like where we can start to really grow and then start to pick out the storytelling that they've told themselves over and over and over again, and maybe repeat it in 12-step rooms for 6 months, years, 6 years, 10 years. Like you repeat that same story and then it gets stored in the body. And so there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of action taking too, right? Like this stuff is not going to heal itself in isolation. So it's like we get into their real life of, now that you know all of these things, how can we bring the whole family system on board? And sometimes I'll even sit with the whole family and do polyvagal ladders. And it's so cool because then everyone knows, like, oh, they're frozen right now. There's nothing wrong with them. They just can't hear me anymore. And so, yeah, so much of my work is like taking the shame out almost immediately, Tracy, to understand that like they have a body and it's been reacting the way it has for a good reason. And then we can move through really understanding what's been their truth the whole time.
That's awesome. That's really awesome because, so many times we're told our traumas are all in our head, and it's so not true. It's in our, all the way down into our cellular level, into our DNA almost, with intergenerational traumas. So, it's not just in our head, and talk therapy is great, but it only goes so far. So dealing with your trauma on a somatic level, on a body level is crucial, I think, to releasing it and getting back to who you truly are.
Absolutely. That's the thing. And I call it regrooving because it's like after we figure that stuff out, like in the body, then we can start regrooving the response that the body has with the thought life. That's where we can start creating a new story, a new dialogue, a new way of thinking, a new way of interrupting the patterns, maybe dropping some of the conditioning of the way that people have talked about themselves until now. And oh my gosh, if anyone is listening out there and people are telling you it's all in your head, oh my gosh, I just want to hold so much space because I just remember that so deeply. When you said that, Tracy, I felt it all through my body. I was like, oh, if I could have been rich by how many people told me that in my 2 years of struggle at treatment centers. And, it's all in your head. It's all in your head. Like,
Yep.
You're just an alcoholic. I'm like, oh my God. No.
No, I'm so much more than that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Amy, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with me today. How can our listeners find you?
Yeah, it's really easy. Instagram, Facebook, my website is all the same. It's at Thrive in Recovery with Amy.
Awesome. That is easy. And listeners, that I'll put all of Amy's contact information in the show notes. If you're listening from one of our partner stations, just head over to releasingtraumapodcast.com, pull up Amy's show, and all her contact information will be there. So Amy, thank you again for coming on. This has been fun.
Yes, thank you. Bye, Tracy.
Bye. And listeners, thank you as always for tuning in, and we'll talk to you in the next show.